So my name is Christina Paschyn. I am a Ukrainian American born and raised in Parma, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland. I currently live in Doha, Qatar, where I teach journalism at Northwestern University in Qatar. So the reason I decided to make my film, it really started since I was a young girl when I was attending Ukrainian school. We had very briefly covered the Crimean Tatars. Mainly, we were told that they were these people who used to fight the Cossacks, right? So this is Ukrainian school, and that was it. That was the extent of their history or knowledge of who they were as a people and their culture, etc. And then when I went off to do my master's degree in Middle East Studies, there was a special course that focused on Islam in Eastern Europe, and it was up to us to kind of investigate different ethnic groups within Eastern Europe who have Muslim backgrounds. So I decided to focus on Crimea, and that's when I really had a chance to study about the whole history of the Crimean Tatars. Really blew my mind in terms of their history, their culture, their relationship with Ukraine, the true story, not the kind of limited narrative I had learned in Ukrainian school, which is really not all that historically accurate. So that's why I wanted to make this film. I finally got around to it in 2012, and I had been planning to tell a very different story, more about the return to Crimea since the deportation, what was happening in Crimea or Ukraine. And then as I was putting it together, the annexation and the invasion happened, and I knew I had to update it and really make it more relevant to today. So my film really covers nearly the whole history of Crimean Tatars. I had very extreme feelings about the situation. On the one hand, I was really upset for my Crimean Tatar friends who I had met. So most of the interviews I had with the Crimean Tatars, they all talked about how even though life was not necessarily perfect under Ukraine, there was still a lot of discrimination and issues happening, that they were happy to be part of Ukraine instead of Russia because of the history of the deportation under Russian rule, the way they were treated in the Soviet Union, and even way before from Catherine the Great in the 1700s. So to many of them had told me that returning to Russia would be their worst nightmare, but many believed at the time that it was never going to happen, that this was it, they were fine and safe in Ukraine for eternity, basically, and then there was no way Russia would try to get Crimea back. And so when 2014 happened, I received a lot of messages of them telling me how scary the situation was and how they didn't know what they wanted to do with their families, to flee or to stay. And I also knew with my film, from that perspective, that I needed to update the story, otherwise it would be obsolete. More importantly, I'd be missing a huge chunk of Crimean history, and I had to include it. First of all, I had been there starting in 2012. I couldn't go back myself, mainly my job obligations. I do teach at a university, and it was happening, during classes and everything, so there was really no way. And the other caveat there was that I had interviewed Sergey Aksyonov, who is now the Prime Minister of Crimea. At the time, he was just a kind of a regular Crimean parliament politician. He's interviewed in my film. I had met him. I was very concerned that if I were to go back, because he knew me already and I had interviewed him, I would be more of a threat, of a target. So instead, and also at the time, they were closing the borders for a lot of international media journalists who just couldn't get in. So I really didn't know financially if it would make sense and if it was worth the risk in that sense. But I had made quite a lot of contacts when I was there in 2012. So I had Crimean journalists on the ground who were sending me back footage. I was directing them in terms of what I wanted shot, what questions to ask people. So I did act as the director still, and it was up to them to get the footage and send it back to me. And then I obviously, working with my editor, we put it all together. I know they had issues, and they had to make sure that they sent me this footage in a safe way, and that they were not themselves being put at risk. But I did get a lot of compelling footage from them. And in the film, although I don't mention that person specifically and the tragedy that occurred there, I do talk about what has happened to other Crimean Tatars. For instance, the exile of Mustafa Cemilev, and several other Majlis officials, the closure of the Majlis headquarters, the closure of the ATR television station that was the only Crimean Tatar language TV channel on the peninsula. Safinar Jamilev, the wife of Mustafa, and what has happened to her and some of the health problems she experienced after the annexation. So I think I still do quite a comprehensive view of what is happening in the peninsula and the atrocious human rights violations that are occurring. It's definitely a very tough situation right now for many Crimean Tatars. Many of them have had to flee Crimea because they were doing dissident work or they openly expressed their non-support for the Russian annexation. Many of the Majlis officials have had to flee at the top levels of the Majlis officials, and though they are still communicating via Skype sometimes, government forces are still constantly raiding houses, other property owned by the Crimean Tatars. So in that sense, it's also kind of hard to get a perspective right now because they are fearful of what could happen to them, they're not openly criticizing the government anymore. That doesn't mean they're in support of the annexation, but it's, again, a very scary situation for many of them. A lot of elements of Crimean Tatar culture and politics are being closed down. The ATR television station, the Majlis headquarters, there have been reports of houses being vandalized, of schools being attacked even, or targeted by security forces. The Crimean, one of the museums for the Tatar people was briefly shut down and then reopened again, but again, the situation's a bit precarious and whether they're going to toe the party line, that kind of thing is happening right now. And I also know there's a lot of debate within the Crimean Tatar community about who is really the new leadership. So a few Crimean Tatars have sided with the Aksyonov and the Russian government. And the Majlis insists that they are not really representative of Crimean Tatar people and that the majority of Crimean Tatars do not support the pro-Russian Crimean Tatars. So in that sense, there's a lot of conflict going on and debate within the community, and it would definitely be interesting to see what happens in the future. I don't necessarily think that they're actively encouraging overtly for Crimean Tatars to leave. There have been raids on homes, searches, government searches, some Tatars report being discriminated against and harassed by Russian nationalists on the peninsula still. There have been sites vandalized still since the annexation or graffitied. As I said before, since the Majlis headquarters was closed, the ATR channel was closed, they're not making an environment that's really conducive for Crimean Tatars to feel that they have freedom of expression, freedom of cultural rights, freedom of assembly even. So in that sense, I just think the overall oppression that's happening is leading many Tatars to leave the peninsula. And from what I understand, many are fleeing to Ukraine, to Kyiv or to Lviv. At the same time, there seems to be a Russian movement to try to co-opt the Crimean Tatar people and movement. One of the Crimean Tatars who has joined the Aksyonov government is Remzi Ilyasov, and he's currently vice speaker of the Crimean State Council, which is basically their parliament. So there's a lot of debate about him because he used to be part of the Crimean Tatar Majlis. He apparently lost in one of the elections to Rafat Chubarov, and there's a lot of gossip and rumors that the reason he joined Aksyonov instead was because he felt very resentful of that situation of not having been elected to be the head of the Majlis. So again, it's kind of hard without me being on the ground to really know what all the politics that are currently going on. But from what it appears to be, the Russian government is also trying to convince in some ways that the Tatars are safe in Russia as long as they are pro-Russian and really supporting the government. So no room for dissent. And when I was there, I did meet Russian nationalists who were very passionate, including Russian Cossacks, as they would call themselves. And when I interviewed Aksyonov, he was part of the Russian Unity Group. And, of course, they were very pro-nationalistic in that sense. From what other media is currently reporting is that there is kind of the slight resentment and people are upset over the fact that Russia is not doing more for Crimea right now, especially since Tatar and Ukrainian activists started the energy and the food blockade against Crimea in order to, kind of make people realize that Crimea should be part of Ukraine and, try to do some sort of that protest movement. So in that sense, I think some people are upset it isn't a paradise as it used to be, or as they thought it would be under Russia, and that Russia is not intervening more. The truth is that they're wrong. It's not historically accurate and factually accurate that Crimea was always Russian in essence. Mainly, and that's the reason I made my documentary film, Crimea belonged to the Crimean Tatars. They are the indigenous population. Let's forget about Ukraine and Russia. It didn't belong really to any of them. It belonged to the Crimean Tatars who later joined as part of the Ottoman Empire. So in that sense, that is the actual history. And in 1441 is when the Crimean Khanate was officially established. So that was way before Catherine the Great came in and invaded and annexed it back then. So obviously, depending on the integrity of some of those historians, they will say one thing, right, to promote the Russian propaganda. Ukrainians will say another thing to promote Ukrainian propaganda. I tried to make sure, and I made sure in my film that the historians I interviewed were not, they're not of Crimean Tatar background or Ukrainian or Russian. They're two Americans who have studied the Crimean Tatars in depth. So in that sense, I think I've provided a really great objective source for that information. I think there's hope in some sense because activists are trying to, as they say, liberate Crimea from Russian occupation. And you see that with the Crimean blockade movement right now, led by many Majlis officials. So in that sense, I think there's hope that they maybe one day might be able to change the situation. You see a lot of comments being made saying that Crimea will be returned to Ukraine by next year. I doubt that will happen. I doubt if it will happen at all. I doubt it will happen for a very, very long time. And I think the situation on the ground in Crimea is very sad for many, many Tatars. Those are the reports I'm getting. The fear, not feeling like they belong anymore. Having a lot of their family members leave and flee Crimea for other places. It's the fear of losing their homeland all over again and still not knowing what the Russian government will do. Part of my story was interviewing people who were desperate for housing. And back in 2012, they were living in small little settlements, basically tiny one-room bedroom shacks where 7 people or more were cramming in there just to find a place to live. They had claimed these shacks on allegedly unclaimed land. And the Russian government officials at that time, Russian officials in the Crimean parliament in 2012, when it was still part of Ukraine, the Russian nationalists were trying to get back that land and claim it really didn't really belong to them and it belonged to other Russians. The Crimean Tatars disputed that. So now that it is part of Russia, there's a fear that their houses will be taken away or they'll be kicked off their land, even in more established communities, that the government will try to take it back for tourism purposes. There's a fear that more things would be shut down, cultural centers or theatrical works. I remember recently that a Crimean Tatar theater group put on a Ukrainian play and they were immediately shut down. So even that kind of freedom of expression is no longer allowed. So in that sense, it's a very trying situation. Look, many of the Crimean Tatars I've spoken with and I've interviewed officials and representatives most of them have talked about how Ukraine really missed an opportunity during up until 2014 to really make use of the Crimean Tatar community, to incorporate them more into Ukrainian government, into Ukrainian society, into that Ukrainian feeling of brothership, and that they should have really had made Crimean Tatars, announced them and declared them to be the indigenous population of Crimea way before the annexation did occur. They missed that opportunity. So in that sense, again, there's a lot of disappointment, resentment with the Ukrainian government that they're not doing more. The reason the Crimean Tatars started the blockade is because they, again, felt like the Ukraine was not doing enough, right, to try to get back Crimea. So again, that was really their first initial initiative, and then later on, more Ukrainian nationalists joined the movement. Mustafa Cemilev is part of the Ukrainian parliament. But whether he's getting all the attention or support from the Ukrainian government remains to be seen. I went in 2012 and I spent a whole month. We were shooting virtually every day for hours on end. So I have about 3 terabytes worth of footage. I used a Canon 5D and I also used a handheld Panasonic, HD quality of course, and a zoom recorder to go with the Canon 5D. It was just me and my husband. He's my co-cinematographer. We did it together on our own. So a 2-person crew for the shooting. And then for editing, I did hire a professional editor. She's been awesome, and she was working primarily on Final Cut. For much of the editing process, I was still debating about what story I should be telling. Do I focus on land issues only and what Crimean Tatars are doing about land issues? Do I tell more of their history? The pieces fell into place when the annexation happened, and that's when I really got on it and started working with a professional editor and putting it all together. It's doing quite well. I'm very happy to say it's been featured. Will be featured in 3 festivals. So it's premiered at the Al Jazeera International Documentary Film Festival in November. It was also accepted into docs for sale at the International Documentary Film Festival in Amsterdam, and I attended that festival, and I also had an opportunity to screen it for a select group of people in the Amsterdam community from the Ukrainian embassy, from OSCE, Crimean Tatars who are living in Amsterdam now. So that was a great screening. It just screened recently at the Borrego Springs Film Festival in California this past month, and then it will be at the DC Independent Film Festival in March. On March 10th is the next festival screening. In addition, I did screen it at the Crimean Tatar Center in Brooklyn, New York. It's called the Association of Crimean Turks, but it's the Crimean Tatar Center basically. So I did that in December, and then next week I'll be screening it at the Ukrainian Institute of America. This has largely been framed as the story and a fight between Ukraine and Russia. And it's been talked about who really owns it, Ukraine or Russia, what's the history there. When really the key component is the Crimean Tatars. If you're thinking about human rights, indigenous people's rights, they were the original masters of the land, according to many historians. And theirs is a story that needs to be remembered. Yes, they make up a small percentage of the population today, only about 12% of Crimea, because of the history of genocide against their people by the Russian Empire and then by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union committed that genocide that historians call a genocide against the Crimean Tatars during the 1944 deportation of their people to Central Asia. So that's why their population has seriously decreased in Crimea. Nevertheless, because they are the indigenous population, their story deserves to be told, their rights deserve to be recognized and to be protected. In some ways, it's similar to the Native American situation in Canada and in America. Again, originally the native inhabitants of the land, and yet nobody pays attention to them nearly as much as they should be, and nobody respects their story. What is unique to the Crimean Tatars, though, is that they are trying to make their name heard, and they're taking specific actions now, such as the Crimea blockade, to make sure that their story does not fade away from the media. I think for 2016 and 2017, there will still be an increase probably in Crimean Tatar activism to somehow change the status of Crimea. I don't think this actual status will change anytime soon. I think this is going to be if the Crimean Tatars are committed to trying to fight against Russia and get back Crimea to be a part of Ukraine, it's going to take a long time, and it won't be happening anytime soon, unfortunately, for their sake. So that's it. I don't have any positive elements or comments to share on that sense. It's a very tough situation for the Crimean Tatars.
The Crimean Tatars' ultimate nightmare came true. Vladimir Putin invaded the Crimea.